Hi, I'm Carl Azus, delivering your May 7th edition of CNN 10. Thank you for taking the time to watch our show. Last night, it looked like a ceasefire was taking hold in the Middle East. It came after a weekend of violence between Israel and Palestinian militant groups. In fact, this was the worst fighting between the two sides since war broke out in 2014. It all started Friday in Gaza, a Palestinian-controlled territory of about 2 million people that borders the Mediterranean Sea. During weekly protests near the fence between Gaza and Israel, a sniper inside Gaza wounded 2 Israeli soldiers, and Israel's military killed 4 Palestinians. The violence got worse throughout the weekend, and by Monday, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, 2 Palestinian militant groups, had fired 690 rockets into Israel, according to the nation's military. And Israel had launched airstrikes against 350 militant targets. At least 4 people in Israel were killed, at least 23 people were killed in Gaza, and the two sides blamed each other for the attacks. The Israeli president said his nation would continue its, quote, massive attacks against terrorist elements, and that Hamas was responsible and would pay a heavy price. The leader of Hamas in Gaza said, quote, the more atrocious the Israeli attacks on the Palestinian civilians are, the stronger the Palestinian response will be. After intense diplomatic work by the United Nations and Egypt to get the two sides to stop fighting, it appeared that things had calmed down on Monday, though the leaders of Israel and Hamas were saying more attacks could be on the horizon. The United Nations specifically spoke out against the launches of rockets into civilian areas of Israel. When that happens, Israel has what's called an Iron Dome defense system in place.
So how does this thing work? 3 key phases to think about. The first one is detection. Anytime rockets launch headed toward Israel, very high-tech cameras, radar systems, and computers start analyzing them. How big are they? How fast are they moving? Importantly, where are they pointed? Because at the same time, the analysis and targeting phase is triggered. What that means is if it sees that some of these are headed off into the water or perhaps headed into rural areas where there's really not much to hit, they just let them go. The whole system says, we're done with you. Go off and explode. You'll make no difference to anyone. But if it spots a missile out there that's aimed toward a building or a town or places where people can get hurt, then those same computers kick into the destruction phase. That means that they communicate with batteries of missiles on the ground and they fire those. And those fly up and get as close as they can to that incoming threat. Each of these defensive missiles may be only about 10 feet long, but has some 24 pounds of high explosives. And when they're close enough, they detonate, obliterating everything in that part of the sky. It works pretty well, and it's not cheap. It was developed originally by an Israeli defense company, but this system has now been supported by about $235 million from the United States. Each of the defensive missiles, by the way, cost around $62,000. But the goal here is to keep making this bigger and more effective so it can reach out further, hit targets further away, engage bigger missiles at higher altitudes. And you know what that's all about? That's about giving both the U.S. and Israel greater defense against more robust enemies at a greater range.
One of the most closely watched indicators of how the U.S. economy is doing indicates it's booming. The Bureau of Labor Statistics recently released its latest jobs report. It provides statistics from the month before on hiring, wages, and the unemployment rate, the percentage of the American workforce that doesn't have a job. The government says 263,000 jobs were added in April. That's more than economists predicted. It says hourly wages for American workers were up 3.2% over last year. That's less than economists predicted. And the report says the unemployment rate dropped even further to 3.6%. That's the lowest level it's been in 50 years. The last time the unemployment rate was that low, the Beatles were still together, and President Donald Trump had recently graduated from college. One factor behind the unemployment rate decrease was because fewer Americans were looking for work. Sometimes that's not seen as a good sign. But there are still more jobs available in America than there are workers to fill them, and overall, the report was seen as very good news for the U.S. economy. 10-second trivia. Which of these historic cathedrals is the oldest? Westminster Abbey, Notre Dame, St. Basil's Cathedral, or St. Stephen's Basilica? Westminster Abbey was originally a monastery. It dates back to the 10th century AD. But it's the Parisian Church of Notre Dame that'll have some 21st century architecture, or at least architecture constructed in this century after a fire on April 15th badly damaged some parts of the 850-year-old cathedral. The Forest of Notre Dame, the name given to the long, interlaced planks of wood that composed the cathedral's roof, was lost. So was the spire that had been built in the 1800s. But Notre Dame's famous stained glass windows, its 18th century great organ, and its artifacts, including the crown of thorns that's believed to have been worn by Jesus Christ, were all saved. As far as the cause goes, investigators have said it was likely an accident, though they haven't confirmed exactly what kind. As France moves forward with plans to rebuild the famous cathedral, there is some controversy brewing over how exactly that should be done. French President Emmanuel Macron suggested that something contemporary could be included, but critics say the rebuild needs to be true to the cathedral's history.
Pencil on paper, it's very old school. Yet perhaps it's the best way to capture the scorched majesty of Paris's 800-year-old Notre Dame Cathedral. French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe announced an international competition to redesign the roof and 300-foot spire the flames destroyed. A task the government, flush with around $1 billion in donations, hopes to finish in 5 years. Architecture students from Notre Dame, the university in the U.S. state of Indiana, that is, are here to draw and study this medieval marvel and plan to join the competition. Texas native Ethan Scott hasn't come up with a specific idea just yet, but he's thinking.
Gothic. It could be bigger, it could be gilded, it could be stone, it could be marble, but I think something that respects what's still there.
A balance between old and new is what's needed, says classmate Jessica Most from San Diego, California.
I think it's important to also stay relevant to what historically was there, as well as keeping it modern.
Keeping it modern, however, has its limits. Already some designers have posted their ideas online. Some are interesting. Paris-based heritage architect Marie-Anne Tech is confident sober heads will prevail, that a masterpiece like Notre Dame, which took 100 years to be built, won't be rebuilt in a rush. It's not a train station. It's not a museum, she tells me. It's a special place, and I believe we should provide this special place all the means necessary to express itself with genius and audacity. The outlines of genius have long been there. It will just take a brilliant mind to fill in what the fire erased. Ben Weaver, CNN, Paris.
We've aired several reports from CNN's Dr. Sanjay Gupta on things people can do to help themselves live to age 100. Today, we've got a bit of advice from a man who actually did that.
Instead of looking at these phones and this, to learn something and how to do something.
The words of George Morrow, who just celebrated his 100th year alongside his twin brother, James Morrow. The centenarian suggested that God had something to do with their longevity, and they advised that people always be honest and truthful. Though George says he feels just as good as he did at age 75, he said he'd rather live back when he was a kid. That would have been during the roaring 1920s. The secret to longevity is an age-old question, but their attitude about it was unflapperable, and it just makes centuries that to decage well, you've got to be good at shifting gears and years, whether you drive a Model T or a Model S, being a model citizen, and keeping good time and company as time goes by. I'm Carl Azus, turning another page in the calendar for CNN 10.